Welcome back to our channel. This is a continuation of our previous video. Tonight we will continue with our true scary horror stories to scare and lure you to sleep. The dark screen is to keep the room dark and enable you to sleep comfortably while listening. Turn off the lights and let the shadows creep in.
Rain leaking through the old roof. Animals seeking shelter from the storm. He forced himself to move, carefully stepping around the wet footprints as though touching them might summon whatever had made them. His flashlight sputtered, its weak beam trembling as if struggling against the encroaching darkness. Every creak beneath his feet seemed to echo, loud, too loud, as though the house itself was awake, listening, waiting. The air felt thick, cold like the breath of something unseen pressing against his skin. His fingers brushed against the damp, peeling wallpaper. Rough, clammy, almost like flesh. Suddenly, a soft creak. Behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the empty, yawning darkness. He strained his ears, heart pounding, breath shallow. The knock came again. Slow, rhythmic, measured. Like someone or something was calling for him, summoning him. His grip on the flashlight tightened, its cold metal biting into his palm. He forced himself to speak again, louder this time. "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer. Only the steady patter of rain and the hollow silence stretching deeper into the house. But then faintly, just barely. He thought he heard something else, something breathing, shallow rasping, coming from the shadows at the end of the hall. The storm outside seemed almost distant now, its endless pounding muffled by the heavy, suffocating stillness of the house. He stepped forward, drawn by some twisted compulsion, every nerve screaming at him to turn back, to run, but his legs moved on their own. He stopped at the base of a narrow staircase, the wood dark with age and stained with something darker still. The flashlight flickered, dimming for just a moment, and in that brief instant, he saw it, a figure, small, frail, standing motionless at the top of the stairs, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured, head tilted, watching. His breath hitched, terror constricting his chest like a vice. He stumbled back, barely catching himself against the wall, eyes still fixed on the spot where the figure had stood. But there was nothing there now, only the silent, decaying staircase stretching into the darkness above. His mind raced. Had he imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? A twisted illusion shaped by exhaustion and fear? But then, the floor above groaned, slowly, deliberately, like cautious footsteps pacing back and forth. Something searching, and then the knock came again, louder this time. Closer. He backed away from the stairs, his breath ragged, every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get out, to run. But as he turned toward the front door, his heart sank. It was open, swinging gently in the wind, water pooling around the threshold, and muddy footprints leading inside. Footprints that hadn't been there before. Paralyzed by dread, he stared at the open door, rain hammering just beyond the threshold. But something kept him rooted in place, something cold, oppressive, like unseen eyes locked onto his every move. The wind hissed through the crack, carrying something with it, faint, distorted, a whisper. His name, spoken slowly, deliberately, from just behind him. The whisper faded into the endless drone of the storm, swallowed by the wind's relentless howl, but the echo of his name still lingered, hanging in the air like a curse. He spun around, flashlight trembling in his grip, illuminating only peeling wallpaper and empty shadows. His breath hitched, heart hammering, but there was nothing, except for a faint, wet, dragging sound coming from deeper inside the house. Against every instinct, he moved toward it, pulled by something he couldn't explain, something cold and ancient, like invisible strings tightening around his chest, forcing him deeper into the house. He found himself in what looked like a sitting room, long abandoned, forgotten by time. A decaying couch slouched against the far wall, its fabric eaten by mildew, shattered glass from a broken window glittering faintly beneath the weak light of a flickering lantern left on a cracked table. And there, at the center of the room, was an old leather-bound book, dark, stained, and unmistakably open. Its pages fluttered gently, though the air was still. He hesitated, breath catching in his throat, but something compelled him forward, as if the house itself wanted him to see, to know. With trembling fingers, he reached down, the leather cover cold and damp, and turned the first page. The diary's entries were disjointed, frantic, growing more desperate with each line. The storm hasn't stopped for days. It knows we're trapped. It won't let us leave. They came from the woods, first just whispers, then knocks. Then, the next lines were smeared, violently scratched out, almost as though someone or something had tried to erase them. He turned another page, ink smudged by dark, water-like stains. They took Henry. They called him by name. We heard him crying, but when we opened the door, there was only the storm. His breath hitched as the knocking came again, slower, harder, like something was no longer asking for permission to enter, but demanding it. His eyes darted back to the diary. Words scrawled frantically across the last entry, barely legible, as if written in a blind panic. Do not answer the knocks. No matter how familiar the voice, it knows your name. Before he could move, the sound of pages flipping furiously erupted. The diary ripped from his grasp, its pages turning wildly, faster than any wind could have managed. And then, the pages stopped. One final blank page, except for a single freshly written line, ink still wet. We're inside now. The storm outside raged, wind shrieking like 1,000 desperate voices. But inside the house, everything was deathly, still. His flashlight sparked back to life, and for one brief, heart-stopping moment, he saw them, twisted, broken figures, soaked in rain, faces hollow, blank, watching from the darkened corners of the room, silent, unmoving, until the knocking came again, this time from inside the house. He stood frozen in the corner of the room, heart pounding in his chest, blood rushing in his ears, drowning out everything else. The figures, those twisted, broken shadows, had not moved. They hadn't spoken, but they were there, waiting. It was as though the air itself was thick with their silent judgment, their cold, hollow stare locking him in place. The flashlight flickered weakly in his hand, casting long, shuddering beams of light that barely touched the dark corners of the room. He dared not look away, knowing deep down that the moment he did, they would be closer, far too close. And then a voice, soft and chilling, came from the very walls themselves. You were expected. The words were cold, empty, as if they had been carved into the very fabric of the house, waiting for him to hear them. His mind raced. You were expected. The words echoed through his skull, rattling his thoughts, twisting his sense of reality. Had he always been meant to come here? Was this his fate? Was this cabin part of a cycle? A place where people like him were destined to vanish into the storm's grasp? And then it hit him. The truth was unfolding around him. But it wasn't just the house that was watching him. It was the storm itself. This wasn't just a place of isolation. It was a prison, a trap. The faces in the shadows moved, just a fraction. Their eyes, hollow and lifeless, seemed to follow him wherever he turned. It was only then that he noticed the other signs. The marks, etched into the floorboards, into the walls. He stumbled backward, his hand brushing the wall, and it gave way, crumbling to reveal something beneath. Something far more disturbing than he ever could have imagined. A wave of nausea hit him as he stumbled forward, pulling at the decaying photographs and frantically scanning the cryptic messages in the newspaper clippings. All of them spoke of the same chilling thing, a curse, a cycle that would claim those foolish enough to seek refuge in this forsaken cabin. Travelers like him who thought they could escape the storm, only to realize that the storm itself was part of the trap, part of the nightmare. The photographs were old, much older than they should have been. Faces stared back at him, their eyes wide with terror, bodies twisted in unnatural ways. The same figures from the shadows, the same twisted, empty eyes. But it was the names that haunted him. All these people, they had been here before, and they had never left. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered, his voice trembling in disbelief. "This is just a nightmare. This isn't real." He spun around, panic surging through him, as a low, guttural growl rumbled from the back of the house. His heart hammered in his chest as the floor beneath him trembled, as though the house itself was alive, awakening from a deep slumber. The storm outside had ceased. The wind, the rain, all had gone silent, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. He staggered toward the door, desperate to escape, but the door would not budge. The handle was cold, unyielding, as though it had been frozen in place, locked by some unseen force. Then the walls, they began to close in on him, slowly, steadily, with a weight that was crushing. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as the space around him shrank. The symbols on the walls, they were shifting, twisting, as if the house itself was alive, breathing with him, feeding on his fear. In the corner of his vision, figures were moving again. They had been there all along, just waiting. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were all he could hear. They were no longer asking for help, no longer waiting. They were demanding, commanding him to listen. "You were expected," they whispered again. "You're part of the cycle now." It was then that the truth became clear to him. The storm wasn't what had brought him here. It wasn't nature that had trapped him. The house, the very walls, had chosen him. He had been brought here for a reason, and there was no escaping it. The flashing images of past victims blurred into one horrific, continuous scene. They had all been like him, lost, seeking shelter in this cursed place, believing they were safe from the storm. But now, they were part of it, trapped forever, unable to leave, unable to escape the cycle of suffering that the house demanded. And now, it was his turn. The walls began to hum, a low, vibrating pulse that seemed to carry the weight of every lost soul that had ever been trapped here. The storm outside had died down, but inside, the air had grown heavy, thick with something ancient. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched long and twisted, as if they had grown tired of waiting for their moment to strike. And then, the silence broke. The house creaked and groaned, as though something immense was shifting within its very bones. Something that had been bound for far too long. Something that now hungered for release. He could feel it now. Feel the cold, ancient presence that had been lurking in the darkness all along. It was not just the house that had ensnared him. It was something else. Something older, more powerful. And it was coming for him now. From the deepest corners of the room, a figure emerged. A tall, gaunt shape, its face obscured by shadows. Its outline was indistinct, but its eyes, those eyes, they glowed an unnatural white, piercing through the darkness with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The figure moved closer, dragging its feet along the floor, the scraping noise growing louder with every step. And with each step, the air grew colder, heavier, until he could see his breath hanging in the air like fog. The figure's hand hovered just inches from his face, the air around it colder than any winter night he'd ever known. And as it drew closer, a single word escaped from its lips, barely a whisper, but one that sent a chill deeper than the bone. "You were expected." He staggered backward, terror gripping his chest like iron shackles. But no matter how far he moved, no matter how hard he fought to escape, the figure kept coming. It was not a person, not a creature. It was something else. And the realization hit him like a blow to the stomach. This spirit was trapped by the storm, by the very house. and it would not let him go. It had been waiting for someone to release it. His heart pounded in his chest, deafening, as the figure's hand reached out, its long fingers brushing against his skin. But in that moment of absolute terror, a crack of thunder split the silence, the house shuddering violently, the lights flickering out completely. In the dark, the figure's form wavered, dissolving, as though it were being drawn into the walls themselves. His breath hitched. He was trapped. He couldn't move. The walls groaned, creaked, and then everything fell silent. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the sound of his breath, ragged and shallow, and the distant rumble of thunder, echoing from far away, as though the storm had not yet finished its work. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the house finally fell silent. No creaks, no whispers. The storm outside was gone, leaving behind only the echo of its wrath. The house had quieted, but that silence, it was not peace. He was alone, but not really, not anymore. He had seen it, felt it, and now it would never let him go. He was part of it, part of the house, part of the storm, forever. As he stood there, paralyzed, he could feel the walls closing in once more, the whispers returning, growing louder, more insistent. But before he could move, before he could scream, the final crack of thunder came, and with it, the blackness swallowed him whole. Do you believe in what you can't see? The next storm may reveal what watches from the shadows. If you've ever felt the presence of something unseen, share your experience in the comments, if you dare. Subscribe and join us for more tales that linger long after the storm fades. Thank you for watching. Subscribe now for more.